All right. That over there. All right, just about everything in place. We'll give it a second to see if more people are logging in, because I like to start once people have arrived, but I can't wait forever. All right, well, I think that is a reasonable amount of time to wait. We do have a little bit more text than usual to work on, so I hope everybody will have sufficient patience. We are picking up in chapter 40 at the top, but then we are going to be jumping, so get ready to scroll. We are at the end of the Mishkan building, of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And as chapter 40 says, and Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, on the first day of the first month, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. So this is the time to erect the Mishkan itself. This is the moment when all the work comes together. A couple things to note is that we are in the second person singular, that when God is telling Moses to put it up, it does feel like this is a command to Moses. Obviously, we are going to wonder, well, what about everyone else that was involved in the construction process? More on that when we reach our commentary. But first, we're going to get down to the actual implementation. Everything up until verse 16 is God giving more of the details of what needs to be done. And from verse 16 on, we get Moses doing what he was told. This Moses did, just as God had commanded him, so he did. In the first month of the second year, on the first of the month, the tabernacle was set up. Moses set up the tabernacle, placing its sockets, setting up its planks, inserting its bars, erecting its posts. He spread the tent over the tabernacle, placing the covering of the tent on the top of it, just as Adonai had commanded Moses. Again, throughout all of this, you can see we are dealing with the third person singular. All the verbs are in the singular form. This feels like Moses doing all of the work. Verse 20, he took the pact and placed it in the ark. He fixed the poles to the ark, placed the cover on top of the ark, and brought the ark inside the tabernacle. Then he put up the curtain for screening and screened off the ark of the pact, just as Adonai had commanded Moses. He placed the table and the tent of meeting outside the curtain on the north side of the tabernacle. Upon it he laid out the setting of bread before Adonai, as Adonai had commanded Moses. He placed the lampstand, the menorah, in the tent of meeting opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle. He lit the lamps before Adonai, as Adonai had commanded Moses. He placed the altar of gold in the tent of meeting before the curtain. On it he burned aromatic incense, as Adonai had commanded Moses. I think you're seeing a pattern here. Then he put up the screen for the entrance of the tabernacle. At the entrance of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, he placed the altar of burnt offering. On it he offered up the burnt offering and the meal offering, as Adonai had commanded Moses. He placed the laver between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it for washing. From it, Moses and Aaron and his sons would wash their hands and feet. They washed when they entered the tent of meeting and when they approached the altar, as Adonai had commanded Moses. And he set up the enclosure around the tabernacle and the altar and put up the screen for the gate of the enclosure. When Moses had finished the work, the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the presence of Adonai filled the tabernacle. And the rest is just what we've talked about in previous classes about the cloud filling and being part of the traveling process. But obviously, you can tell by what I'm emphasizing today, we are focusing on the actual construction of the Mishkan. If I had to ask you who made the Mishkan, I'm guessing that the knee-jerk reaction would be the Israelites. After all, we saw from all of the previous chapters that many different people with different skills and talents, most notably Bezalel and Holiav, were involved in the construction of all of the implements and making them, and or of contributing all of the ingredients for the tent as well as the implements. But if we ask who constructed the Mishkan, who actually put it up, well, we know eventually that this is going to be given as a responsibility to the Levites, and each different clan will have different responsibilities for different parts. But here, on the very first construction, more or less, it seems to have been worded throughout that Moses is the one doing it. Now, the easiest explanation for that in modern terminology would be to say that Moses was the supervisor, he was the general contractor, and he was in charge of the entire construction, and the buck stopped there. He was the one that was responsible to make sure that the final form would indeed match exactly what God had commanded him to make. And we are just going through a checklist of saying Moses checked it and it was right. That's perfectly fine and an acceptable reading. But of course, that would be a very short class. Instead, we need to wrestle with the language and the grammar, as our ancestors have, and said, is there something we're being taught about the building of this very first space that will be dedicated as the centerpiece of our religious worship? Is there something special going on here that is being highlighted by this language that is not merely a shorthand for Moses was the manager? And that is what we're going to dive into. But before we look at the commentary on this, which will relate to the commentary on the building of the temples, and in particular, the commentary on the building of the third temple, that's the one that hasn't shown up yet. The third temple is the temple that will be in the days of Mashiach, the days of the Messiah. Are there any other questions on chapter 40? All right.
But one quick question. This doesn't seem like it would be something that could be accomplished very fast. But also, if he's doing this to teach people, wouldn't he have to do it several times just so that the people who are going to have responsibility would then know how to do it? Is this training, in other words, for the Levites in some ways?
So indeed, one of the explanations that we will come across is that Moses is building and unbuilding the Mishkan multiple times as an instructional video to try and guide them. Because like you say, this is not something that is self-evident. Anybody who's ever tried to put together a backyard shed or a children's play structure will know that even with visual instructions or verbal instructions, you may have some difficulty. And so going over it a few times before it's becomes someone else's responsibility would probably be a good idea. And really, that could be what's going on here, because ultimately this is not a one-person job. It's fine to say that maybe Moses, positioned the menorah, or maybe Moses positioned the lechem panim, the showbread, but throwing the cover over the Mishkan is just, no, it's humanly impossible for a single person to have done that. Erecting the fence around the Mishkan is impossible. The boards and the canvas are not something that could ever be manhandled into place by just one person doing it. So yes, we're still left with the idea that this needed to be a team effort. And that idea of the effort and the building and what that implies for the future, for a third temple, is precisely where we are headed. All right. Oh, let's zoom that in. Sorry for the small text for those of you who are on small screens. All right. So first, we want to go ahead and just take a look at a little bit of the philosophy that is going to be evident throughout. and this is from Kli Yakar, and this is from the chapter that we are dealing with. Many of the other quotes and texts will be on other chapters, far afield. The Mishkan was set up, right? It's that lovely passive voice. For anybody here that isn't a grammar expert, just a reminder that passive voice means that you are highlighting the object to which the action was done, rather than highlighting the person who did the action. If I say the letter was written, that's passive voice because I didn't say who wrote it. I'm just emphasizing the accomplishment, the letter having been written. If I say Bob writes the letter, that is an active voice sentence because I am telling you the actor. I'm telling you Bob wrote the actual letter. And here, the hukam, the verb that's used for erecting the Mishkan, is saying that it was in passive voice. Why would that be, says Kli Yakar? The passive voice is used here to indicate that it could not be set up by human hands. That actually it was set up, but it could not have been set up by people. Nevertheless, God told Moses to make the attempt, and it would arise on its own. This was a hint concerning all human endeavor. A person may begin a task, but it is God who completes it. So Kli Yakar is channeling sort of a mystical side here, although this can certainly be understood from a demystical perspective as well, which is to say, ultimately, whether an endeavor succeeds or fails is up to God, but there does need to be a human component to it. Obviously, God could have simply willed the Mishkan into existence, either by taking the parts that have been made and arranging them, or by creating the parts in the first place. But the whole endeavor of the Mishkan is trying to remind us that the creation of anything on earth from this point forward is a joint effort, that the final completion may be in God's hands, but we have to engage in creating the foundation, the preparation, the legwork, if we are going to make sure that there is that room for godly completion. Now, like I said, he sees this very much from a mystical point of view, that it actually was God physically manipulating it into place. But even from a demystified point of view, we can understand this as being God is emphasizing that this is something that only will work and be maintained with godly approval. And that, of course, we know to be true, coming up to the destruction of the first and second temples, where there no longer was godly approval for the nation in those generations. Now, he goes on to say, in the way that our verses are repetitive, the setting up for the Mishkan is mentioned 3 times in verses 2, 17, and 18, like we skimmed through. Some say that this is to foreshadow the 3 holy temples. Thus, in 2 of the verses, 2 and 8, the verb appears in its active form, indicating that Bnei Yisrael would build the first two temples actively through their merits. The verse 17, by contrast, is the passive voice is used, which hints that the construction of the 3rd temple would not depend upon human merit. Thus, the sages teach that when the time comes, the redemption will take place, even if the generation is entirely guilty. Now, you'll notice that he is playing a little bit with the timeline here. If we were going to go by temples in order, it would be 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 2, 17, 18. But that doesn't work from what we know historically. So instead, he's working off grammatical order, that active and active, 2 and 18, imply the 2 temples that were built by the effort of the Israelites, both by their merits as well as by their physical activity. And the 3rd temple is going to be built regardless of human merit, meaning that even if the generation is not righteous, if it is the time for redemption, redemption will happen. And the 3rd temple, passive voice, will be built. Now that is going to open up in the back of our minds, hopefully, the idea of, well, wait a minute, if the generation is entirely guilty, if there is no righteousness at all, who's building the 3rd temple? Hold that thought, because we are going to wrestle with that for much of our discussion today. But first, let's continue with a little bit of Rabbeinu Bachya. Bitzalel, Oholiav, and all the artisans were endeavoring to erect the tabernacle, but were unable to do so. Thus, in 39:33, which we didn't read together, they brought the tabernacle to Moses. It's an odd phrase. The reason they brought it to Moses was their inability to erect it so that it would remain standing. So he is reading from the Midrash the idea that the bringing of the Mishkan to Moses is indicative of all of the artisans being unable to correctly make it stand. As I mentioned before, even putting up a garden shed can be difficult if you don't have precise instructions or practice. And they bring it to Moses because they have failed. They have tried to erect it. They have done all they can, but it keeps collapsing. Moses felt very badly about all of this, seeing as he had not had a personal share in working on the tabernacle. He didn't actually make the things. God consoled him, telling him that no other human being would be able to put up the tabernacle. Whereas as soon as Moses would begin to busy himself with it, with erecting it, it would erect itself. So again, very similar to the Kli Yakar vision. Here we have a little bit more of a narrative to put it into, and also a little bit more of the personality, that Moses didn't want to be the one to take the credit for building the tabernacle when he had not made the tabernacle. But God explains, you are the only person who will be able to. After hearing this, Moses said to God, I do not know how to put it up. Like, well, that's very nice, but I actually don't know how it goes together any better than they do. God answered him, you begin to busy yourself with it, and seeing that you have been shown it when it stood, it will stand by itself, corresponding to the vision you had, implying that Moses had seen the Mishkan in his journey to Shemayim, to heaven, when he received the Torah. This is the meaning of the words, the tabernacle was erected, again emphasizing the passive voice. God added further that he would write the erection of the tabernacle was credited to Moses. Thus, Moses put up the tabernacle. So, to explain why we have this unusual emphasis on Moses for the creation of the tabernacle, as well as for the passive voice of it being erected, we are told by Rabbeinu Bachya, it is because, again, really it was God that was actually putting it together. The humans might have had the components, but they couldn't put it together. And only someone like Moses would be able to move the project along such that would actually be able to come to completion with God's assistance. All right, questions or comments so far? Because we're going to move from the past to the future. And I don't want to lose anyone. Okay, so with this in mind, we then will ask ourselves, well, what about the first temple? What about the second temple? And most importantly for today, what about the third temple? That is to say, the temple of the future, the temple that will come in the days of Mashiach. Well, the first and second temple were definitely built by human hands. We have the explanation of the permission to build during the days of Solomon and then during the days of Cyrus, following the Babylonian return. And we know that it was built. We have descriptions of it being built. The third temple, on the other hand, is a little bit more difficult to understand. We're going to start with what is perhaps a simplest, clearest understanding, which is from Rambam. And, we'll talk about who he sees as building the temple. Now, if a king should arise from the house of David, who is versed in Torah and engages in the commandments, as did David his forefather, in accordance with both the written and the oral Torahs, and he enjoins all of Israel to follow in its ways and encourages them to repair its breaches, and he fights the wars of God, that is to say, he defends Israel, then he may be presumed to be the Messiah. So these are the necessary elements for us to look at a person and say, you know, maybe this person could be Mashiach. Comes from the right family, is doing the right things. This is a maybe person, a possible candidate. If he succeeds in his efforts and defeats the enemies around and builds the sanctuary in its proper place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is definitely the Messiah. So how will you know who the Mashiach is? By the accomplishment that the Mashiach creates. Now, what this sets up, of course, is a basic structure where Rambam is saying that the Mashiach will lead the people to build the temple, and that the completion of the temple through this earthly endeavor will be part of the checklist for us to confirm that this person is indeed definitely Mashiach. And if the temple isn't built, then he's not Mashiach. So this implies that the third temple will be built by us, by regular human beings that are busy in the days of Mashiach, or the person they presume to be Mashiach, to settle and to defend and stop the wars and all of the other things that he's already mentioned. So in the category of third temple building, Rambam seems to be on the side of it will be a human endeavor. Or maybe not, because certainly there are many people who will read this and say the building of the sanctuary ultimately will be dependent upon God, and this may be nothing more than the actions of Moses. Moses didn't build the sanctuary, he got things rolling, and it was God who miraculously brought its completion to the end. And it couldn't have been done without that divine assistance. So perhaps this isn't saying all of the bricks will be laid by Mashiach, but instead saying the Mashiach will begin the process, and there will be some other form of completion that will happen that will be more in God's hands. Just trying to point out that there are at least two different ways to understand what Rambam is saying here. But definitely, definitely the simplest, most basic reading of the text would seem to imply that the third temple will be built by the nation of Israel under the leadership of the person presumed to be the Mashiach. Okay. In the Midrash, however, it is a little different. And so did Rav Shmuel bar Abba say, the Holy One, blessed is he, said to Israel, even though the temple is destined to be destroyed in the future, and the sacrifices to be nullified, do not allow yourself to forget the order of the sacrifices, but rather be careful to read about them and review them. And if you occupy yourself with them, I will count it for you as if you were occupied with the sacrifices themselves. This is one of the reasons why in our prayer services, we have in the appropriate places references to the different sacrificial services. We may not be able to offer them, but by reminding ourselves of their content, it is as though we were offering them even now. So the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Yechezkel, the prophet Ezekiel, and because my children are in exile, the building of my temple should be idle, right? It's that wonderful rhetorical question. Just because you're in exile and not actually there at the site of Jerusalem, and you're not actually able to build anything because the Babylonians won't let you, do you call that an excuse for not building my third temple, or rather second temple in this generation? Is that an excuse? Most of us would think that was a pretty good excuse. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, it is reading in the Torah. Its reading in the Torah is as great as its building. Go and say to them, and they will occupy themselves to read the form of the temple in the Torah, and in reward for its reading, that they occupy themselves to read about it, I count it for them as if they were occupied with the building of the temple. So just as we say that saying and reading about the sacrifices is the same as offering them, so too says the Midrash, that in the reminder of the form of the temple and Mishkan as well, it is the same as though actually building it. And indeed, the text from Yechezkel, which talks about the building, wasn't necessarily just an order to build, because obviously that was not possible in that generation, but was instead giving people the opportunity to earn the same merit as though they had carried the bricks themselves. Now, this is a wonderful way of saying we're off the hook then. We don't have to worry about the third temple, just keep reading about it, and it's the same as though we were building it. And indeed, there are many people who interpret it in that way as being a very powerful spiritual outlet for our desire to rebuild a central location of worship, is to reread the passages of it, and in the process of doing so, to feel that we are spiritually building, even if not physically so, and that those are equivalents. Questions or comments so far?
I'm looking at Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is told to relate all that he has seen to the house of Israel. So, of course, the conversations that would be sparked by his relating what he sees, how does that compare to the text? Quick, let's look up in our Torah scrolls. Certainly that would be generate a lot of conversation at the very least.
Absolutely. Much like the old joke of "I dare you not to think about a white elephant," is going to trigger an image of white elephant to appear in your head. So too, if you say, let's talk about the temple we're going to build, people are naturally going to be led into thinking about the temple, which, according to this midrash, is the equivalent of actually building it. All right, and he continues, but this time Rabbeinu Bachya continues from before, but this time in connection to Bereshit. Seeing that the first two temples were constructed by human hands, by the instructions of Solomon and Koresh, respectively, they did not endure. The third temple will be constructed by God himself and will no longer be subject to destruction. This is why God's name is associated here with the digging of the third well. We're going to come back to the well reference in a second, but that's just a little bit of a foretaste. But notice the underlying logic. He is saying that the first two temples have both been destroyed. The third temple is going to be the last, final, permanent one. What will be different about it? Well, the first two were built by us. The third one has to be different. Therefore, it will be built by God. And yes, he means built by God, not by God's specifications. That we are talking about a miraculous construction. Now, Rabbeinu Bachya, as we've seen in many other classes, often does tend towards the mystical and supernatural, but he is not alone in this particular opinion. And as we're going to see, this is a very wide-held belief with some good reasons. But this is the first taste of it that I wanted to bring. Bereshit Rabbah continues as follows. In the days of Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah, the evil kingdom, which was the euphemism for Rome, decreed to rebuild the temple. Indeed, there was a time during the late Roman Empire where we were given permission to begin reconstruction. And, well, Pappos and Lilianos, two brothers who were later martyred in Lod, set up tables from Akko to Antioch and supplied the pilgrims from the diaspora with silver, gold, and all of their needs. So, apparently, when we were given permission, according to the Midrash and according to all other historical accounts, we took it. We were willing to begin the rebuilding. This would seem to imply that the average community did not think that God was going to drop the heaven out of the sky, but that instead they were responsible for building it. And with this new opportunity and this narrow window in Roman history of allowing us to begin that reconstruction, they took that window and they tried their best. Now, obviously, it didn't work out. It failed, and for a lot of different reasons, which are not the subject of our discussion today. But for the moment, at least, realize that this community was certainly of the opinion that the third temple was not coming from heaven, but was going to be built by human labor. And on that same idea, Sefer HaChinuch, when talking about mitzvah 95 in his list of mitzvot, says, and this commandment, meaning the building of the temple, is practiced at the time that most of Israel is upon their land. So the first condition is that there needs to be a majority of Jews in Israel. If the majority of the world Jewish population is there, then the commandment becomes active and must be fulfilled. And this commandment is from the commandments that are not incumbent upon the individual, but rather upon all of the community. When the temple is built speedily in our days, a positive commandment will be fulfilled. There are certain commandments, such as the public reading of the Torah, that are a community responsibility rather than a purely individual responsibility. and so too the temple. But the underlying assumption of the author of Sefer HaChinuch is this will be an actual physical commandment that the community will have to put into practice when the time is right. But on the other hand, we can go back to Rashi, one of the greatest sages of all, and commentators on the Talmud, and the Tosafot, other sages from the generations following him agree the building of the future, meaning the temple of the future, meaning the third temple, will come through the hand of heaven. He believes, and so does Tosafot as well, that it will not be a human activity that creates the third temple, but will be a divine activity. However, he also says in his commentary on Ezekiel 43, we need to know the dimensions of Beit HaMikdash, the temple, so that we know how to build it. He also implies that we need blueprints. Well, if it's going to be built biyad Shemaim, and by the hand of heaven, if it's going to be built b'Shemaim, in heaven, and then descend, as many people describe in other texts, why do I need blueprints? Right? I don't need the blueprints to my car because I bought my car, I didn't have to build it. But if I'm making a model, I need blueprints. So what's going on here? Will the temple be built by human hands, or will it be built by divine decree? That is a tension that is running throughout history. I'd like to pause here for just a moment to try and explore why this tension was perhaps historically so important, and why it was talked about in all of these different ways. And to understand that, we have to really understand how especially the Second Temple was destroyed, and the failure of successive revolts against Rome during the early days of the codification of the Mishnah and then the Talmud. And that is, Israel was in trouble. And it was in trouble not because people were running away from Judaism, though that's always been a bit of a problem in different times and places, but because of the zealotry, the zeal of the Jews. We were troublemakers for the Romans. Now, they deserved it, much like the current state with Russian forces trying to invade Ukraine. The Romans had no business being in our country and behaved absolutely bestially and deserved to be thrown out. But we lacked the ability to do so successfully. And so each successive revolt, even those like Bar Kokhba, which were successful for a short time, ultimately led to greater reprisals and greater death and greater destruction and greater harm to the community. And so the aspirations for independence, which for some were political and others were religious, often led to catastrophes. And, Israel was isolated in the days. Again, to talk to the modern situation, the Ukraine has the support of so many nations, and I'm very grateful to hear that. Israel had no one that was on their side. No one was willing to stand up to Rome in order to help Judea become a free country again and to allow them to build their temple again. As such, the rabbis in general were very skeptical and very negative towards talk of rebellion and rebuilding and restructuring. They wanted that to be focused on as an individual's passion for their faith rather than as an individual taking up arms. On the other hand, to lose sight of the importance of Jerusalem, to lose sight of the importance of the temple, to lose sight of the importance of the sacrificial services and of the unity of our people as symbolized through all of this, that was also catastrophic. We couldn't give up on having that as being the dream. And so some will talk about it, like Rambam, as being merely part of, yes, a matter of fact, future day, this is what's going to happen, but we'll wait and see, as the antidote to the violent zealotry. Others decided that to take it more metaphorically. Yes, it'll eventually happen, but when it happens, it'll happen automatically. Maybe by descending from heaven, maybe by divine fiat, maybe by divine decree, but you don't have to do anything about it today. there's no reason for you to go out and start buying spears or buying bricks. When it happens, it'll happen. And in the moment, don't cause any trouble that's going to get us more persecuted and murdered than we already have suffered. Now, that attitude is something that I have found a lot of Jews have had difficulty accepting, especially since 1967, with the outstanding success of Israel in the Six-Day War and the seeming inevitability of the modern state of Israel's existence. Most Jews have focused on Jewish strength and Jewish pride, and it has been amazing and rejuvenating. And that means they're also blind to the historical realities of the last 2,000 years, and also are sometimes arrogant or even dismissive of the reality that most of our ancestors had to live through, and the difficulty of trying to keep a hope alive without triggering too many false messiahs, false rebellions, and other actions which would have destroyed our people. So for the moment, let's just say that our ancestors had to struggle with this due to the times they lived. But we also have to struggle with this, of course, because we live in a very privileged time, and we actually are in possession of Jerusalem. And the question of rebuilding the third temple has become, once again, a political topic of what should be done in Jerusalem. We're going to come back to that modern question as we go, but I wanted to make sure we had that little bit of digression to help you understand why this topic was important for the last 2,000 years, and a little bit about why it's going to continue to be important. All right, so going back again to Rashi and then followed up by Rambam on the topic, one of the reasons why this notion of how it's going to be built is topical is because in Masechet Sukkah in the Talmud, it talks about not being allowed to build the temple at night or on Yom Tov, meaning on a particular day. Now, Rashi in his commentary on this section of the Talmud says the following: a person is not allowed to build Beit HaMikdash at night or on Yom Tov, but for the future Beit HaMikdash, this rule doesn't apply because God is building it. As it says in Shemot, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands established. Again, here in Sukkah, Rashi's commentary seems to imply very explicitly that we don't need to worry about when the third temple will be built, day, night, Yom Tov, Shabbat, or anything like that, because we won't be building it. And this is a very clear statement by Rashi that it will definitely not be our hands laying the bricks. Because if we were laying the bricks, then we would need to be very concerned about the rules of when we build or don't build. Now, as you might expect, Rambam, of course, thinks that we will be building it, and so he is clearer on exactly those rules. The temple is not to be built at night, as it says, and on the day the tabernacle was erected. We erect it during the day, but not at night. We may work on the construction from dawn until the stars come out, the beginning of night, and everyone is obligated to build, helping physically and financially, both men and women, just like the sanctuary in the desert. Again, going back to the Mishkan's construction, he believes everyone will be participating in the building of the third. However, we do not close the schools in order for the children to build the temple, nor does building the temple override Shabbat or the festivals. The last two, like I said, are the main topic of the section of Sukkah, but that idea about not closing the schools for children, I have always found very powerful and touching. That as important as the temple is, not only does it not override Shabbat or festivals, which is easier to find the justification in the Torah itself. Indeed, it's about the building of the Mishkan that we learn many of the restrictions about Shabbat Melacha, about Shabbat labor. But the idea that we would also not stop study for children for the building of the Mikdash is very, very powerful. The temple does not replace our understanding and our learning, which allows us to connect to God and to each other. The temple is meant to be the fulfillment of that. And if we were to sacrifice our learning in order to build the structure, we would be absolutely perverting the whole purpose for which everything was being undertaken. And especially for children who are in most need of learning as they are at the beginning of their life, and the rest of us hopefully have learned enough that our building vacation from learning will be okay. we need to make sure they get that foundation. And that foundation for children is even more important than them helping to build the temple itself. All right, questions or comments before we get into more of our discussion about the tension of building or not building? Okay, so continuing with Rambam from one of his letters, he says, those people who convince themselves that they will remain in exile where they cannot perform the commandments until the king, the Messiah, arrives, because there are many commandments that we cannot do until the exile is over, and then they will all go to Jerusalem. They are not only fooling themselves, but they are causing others to sin as well, because there is no fixed time set for the Messiah to arrive. But the obligation of our religion and the commandments is not dependent on the arrival of the King Messiah. So he's saying, don't just sit around waiting for Mashiach. There is a lot we can do in the meantime. Rather, it is our duty to be occupied with the Torah and commandments, doing our best to fulfill them. After we have seen to our obligations, if God finds us worthy to see the Messiah, then good. But if not, we have lost nothing, and we have fulfilled our obligation. So Rambam says, build and work today as though the Messiah was arriving later on. And if the Messiah shows up, perfect. You've done everything you can, and obviously you were worthy, and now the Messiah is here. And if not, well, you weren't building it just for the Messiah, meaning you weren't building a good life and living a life of Torah just to make the Messiah appear on your schedule. You were doing it because it is the correct thing to do. It is your duty, your chiyuv. And therefore, you have done what you should have done. And whether or not you get the bonus of Mashiach's arrival or not is immaterial. And likewise, when it comes to whether it be the mitzvot of Israel or the mitzvot of building the temple, we should be doing what we can. Now, in his day and age, what they could do was nothing. I will point out that personally, Rambam did move to Israel and found it to be such a difficult community to live in because of the extreme poverty that he left. So he did not believe that this needed to be pursued with a fanatical, singular devotion to trying to climb up to the Temple Mount every day and put down a brick. But instead, he seemed to believe that everyone should do what was possible, our best to fulfill them under the current circumstances in which they lived. And in his day and age, that meant not trying to rebuild the temple, but trying to do everything that was possible. It's a very, very practical opinion, which Rambam has often had. Of course, it does open the question for the modern world of, are we capable of doing more now than our ancestors were capable of doing 1,000 years ago? And if so, does that change the balance of our obligation? We will come back to that. But first, as promised, the wells of Isaac, which is seen by many of our commentaries and midrashim as being a metaphor for the three temples. Torah's lengthy account of Isaac's wells would seem to be of no benefit or honor to Isaac, since his father did the same thing. Basically answering the question that most people have, why are you telling me about Isaac with a bunch of wells? Didn't we already do this with Abraham? How is this important, interesting, or insightful? However, there is a hidden matter involved here, since Scripture's purpose is to make known a future matter. This is not just talking about wells, this is talking about something more. A well of living water alludes to the house of God. The idea of living water, of Mayim Chayim, as being a metaphor for God and as being a symbol for the temple is well established in many other midrashim. He called the first well Esek, or contention, which is an allusion to the first house, meaning the first temple, concerning which the nations contended with us and instigated quarrels and wars with us until they destroyed it. The second well he called Sitna, enmity. This alludes to the second house, and during its entire existence, they were a source of enmity to us until they destroyed it and drove us from it into bitter exile. The third well he called Rehovot, spacious. This is a reference to the future house, meaning third temple, which will be speedily built in our days, and it will be done without quarrel and feud. and God will enlarge our borders, even as it says, and if the eternal, your God, enlarge your border, which refers to the future. All right. What Ramban is saying here is that we can map the three temples onto these three wells. And as the first two were built under clouds of contention and enmity, of fighting and of anger and of hatred, they ultimately could not endure. The third temple, however, will need to be built under a cloud of peace, a cloud of no quarrels, of no anger, of no hatred. That will be rechovot, that will be a time of great breadth of spirit, if you will, that was not possible in the past. But that is, of course, setting up a condition for the building of the third temple, that it's not going to be built under a contention or enmity, that it will only be built when there is the peace to actually build it. Rav Kook, as well, seems to echo this particular idea. The Beit HaMikdash is different than all other places in Israel. All other places we need to conquer, but the Beit HaMikdash cannot be conquered. Rather, the other nation must be willing to give it to us with recognition that we are entitled to Har Habayit, the Temple Mount. That is how we received Har Habayit in the first place. With David, we conquered all of Israel, but for Har HaMoriah, another term for the Temple Mount, David HaMelech bought it from Aravna HaYevusi, Aravna the Jebusite, I guess is the English, insisting on paying instead of just taking it. Therefore, we cannot build the Beit HaMikdash until all other nations recognize that we are entitled to do so, and for them to be willing to allow. So Rav Kook was the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel, and an incredibly insightful and brilliant mind, and one that understood the world around him in great depth and all of its complexity. And he sees that with the coming of the new state, that there is going to be a desire to rebuild the temple, to conquer Har Habayit, to drive the tractors up onto the top, to bulldoze the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and to recreate the third temple, or rather create the third temple, to recreate the temples. And he is arguing that that's not possible. Yes, the rest of Israel should be conquered, settled, and at peace, and we hope that will happen soon. But in particular, the temple cannot be built through conquest. The temple has to be built through acceptance, because the temple is meant to be, this third temple in particular, the temple for all people, for all time, for all peace. And to lay its foundation in war and blood would be counter to everything the temple is meant to stand for, and would be an illegitimate form. Going back to that idea of the third temple being built by heaven, I believe that most of our ancestors, when they describe that, are channeling the same idea that Rav Kook and Ramban and others are mentioning here, that the temple is not merely a site for political pride and for nationalistic fervor. Yes, we should be proud and happy with Israel, and we will be proud and happy when the temple is built, but it cannot be built as an act of nationalism. It is built as an act of internationalism, as a sign that we are accepted by all the nations. And we're not there yet. We will someday. And someday, all of the world will gladly join together in either welcoming the temple as it comes from God directly, or in helping us to build it in the more mundane fashion. In either case, it'll be a miracle, and one that should be looked forward to with great joy. And we should not lament the absence of the temple at the moment, even if we have the military might to make it happen. We should lament the lack of global will that is keeping this from being created. And as we see the war in Ukraine continuing to unfold, we know that the world is unfortunately still very much wedded to the ideas of war. But we will get there eventually, and the backlash against Russia is indicative of that. And just to finish with one more idea of what we do in the meantime. How do we help with this process? Well, from Arvei Nachal, we hear God places watchmen over the walls of Jerusalem. We are those watchmen. We are constantly building it in heaven, and every Jew is expected to contribute. Every good deed we do is another brick in the Beit HaMikdash. So he is saying again, like many others, the temple is built in heaven, but we do have a part in building it. When we do a mitzvah, we are adding a brick to that temple. But you'd think we built it by now, right? I mean, come on, how many more mitzvot do we need? It's been a couple thousand years. The watchman that God places, for every mitzvah one does, someone is saying Lashon Hara and taking another brick down. So yes, we are the watchmen building, but we are also continually removing those bricks as we continue to transgress. The watchmen that God places are the Jews that tell one another that we could do better. We have to continue to be the watchmen and be the builders. So the temple is being built, it is being prepared, but it's going to be prepared by our following of the mitzvot, by our goodness and by the rightness of our life. And the more we do that, the sooner it will come, not just in the idea of descending from heaven, but by creating a world where the temple can truly endure for all time, by creating a world built off the Torah, which, remember, we don't cancel our kids studying, even to build the temple itself. In that, all of the opinions agree that this is ultimately, at the moment, the greatest thing we can do to contribute to the building of the next temple, is to live a life of Torah and to live a life of what is good and to help watch over each other. Any other questions or final thoughts?
I keep on looking at verse 17, which is, it was in the first month of the second year, on the first month that the Mishkan was erected, is kind of, that's our message of hope, that in its time for the third temple, it will come about speedily. In its time, it will be done. And what's very heartening is the people only had Torah really for a short period of time, yet they somehow were able to get this done. And should be inspiring, that if we can get our act together, it could be done quickly. But there was also, a whole lot of preparation work too. We've had weeks and weeks and chapter and verse of all the preparation that had to be done. And that's all those mitzvot, all the hours, all the effort that the whole community had to put forth before the end result was there.
Correct. And it's not coincidental, of course, that it's being completed in the first month, because remember, the first month is the anniversary of the Exodus. So the idea of redemption from Egypt, and now the symbol of the redemption through the Mishkan is very, very powerful, and drawing that continual parallel, hopefully pointing us in the right direction. All right, well, thank you all for joining me for another Torah study. We will be beginning the book of Vayikra next week. Take care, everyone.